Here we are. We are live.
Hey, everyone. Oh, I see so many familiar names. Ted, of
I
course, from
know.
our
It's
Shaping
great.
Change group, and Lisa, and lots of familiar names. Thank you for being here. So excited to see you.
Can you believe that we are like winding this down?
Well, let's start with, can you believe this is our 22nd?
That's really what it is. Like we're still doing this
2 years
because we're
in.
still in a pandemic.
Still in a
Omi-
pandemic and still drawing,
Omicron, anyone?
yeah, and still drawing lessons, from the work and life of Octavia Butler, and still a place for us to share with all of you. So yes, this is the penultimate broadcast, but hopefully the spirit of the broadcast will stay with all of us.
Can I just say that's a word I never get to say enough?
I know, that's
Penultimate.
why I used it. I was going to say second to last, but penultimate just sounds so much better.
It does. And like I said, it's a word that's in your vocabulary, but you just don't get to pull out enough.
Oh yeah, and I want to say, anyone who is here, I see there's someone from Ohio, and there were a lot of tornadoes and some unusual
There was in the Midwest, right?
places.
Especially for
And
this time of year.
anyone who was in a tornado zone, wishing you well. And the word climate comes to mind when we see phenomena like this. I don't know, the relationship between climate change and tornadoes, but I imagine there is.
That's right. You're from hurricane country, not tornado
I'm
country.
from hurricane. Yes, I fled hurricane country from Miami, Florida. Now I live in
Yeah, well,
California in earthquake country.
my country. Everyone's got
Yeah.
something, right? I grew up in the Midwest, though, so we know the land of tornado drills, and it's when that hot and cold weather come together, which is bound to happen, but it usually happens at the change of seasons, right?
Mm.
So there's certain seasons for that. And so it is. I think it's because our seasons are different, and things are warmer when it didn't used to be warmer. And let's officially get started, then we can keep chatting. We have some great questions too. Let's see.
Thank you all for being here
So
too. Usually we have a guest, as you know, but this time we decided, hey, let's just have the two of us. I don't think we've ever
that was
done that, have we, Monica?
not since the beginning,
Okay.
not since the very beginning. So it is, as you said, I had 21 here, but I meant to have 22. So it is the 22nd. Octavia tried.
So yeah, introductions, conversation, Q&A.
Q&A.
Of course, people are wondering how to stream the previous episodes, and that's an easy one. Because, right, Monica?
OctaviaTried.com.
OctaviaTried.com is a library of our previous episodes, our previous guests. And if you're talking about us on social media, please don't forget to use the hashtag OctaviaTried.
Should we go ahead and introduce? I love this part where I get introduced.
Okay, let's do it. Who am
Let's
I?
do it. Tananarive Due is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She is an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. A leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years, Due has won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award, and her writing has been included in Best of the Year anthologies. Her books include Ghost Summer, Stories, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. She and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Due, co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. She is married to author Stephen Barnes, with whom she collaborates on screenplays. They live with their son, Jason, and 2 cats. I'm so glad that these 2 cats have survived the pandemic and we haven't had to change that part
They
of the
have.
bio.
My co-host, the incredible Reverend Dr. Monica A. Coleman. I love saying Reverend Doctor. Is a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. She's also an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the church of my grandmother, and initiate of traditional Yoruba religion. She works at the intersection of faith, culture, and social justice. She's the author or editor of 6 books and several articles and book chapters that focus on the role of faith and addressing critical social and philosophical issues. Her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, A Womanist Theology, is required reading at colleges and universities around the country. Her memoir, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Faith and Depression, received the Silver Illumination Award in 2017. Dr. Coleman speaks widely on religious pluralism, religion and mental health, sexual and domestic violence, and navigating change. She lives in a lively intergenerational household where she's an avid vegan cook and cyclist. So that's who we are.
With that, let's begin our conversation.
Yeah,
let me figure out how to end the slides. There we go.
You know, usually when we have guests, and I know we have a lot of questions too, which I'm about to look at, but we talk about, we ask them what their pandemic experience has been like, and also how they first interacted with Octavia's work. And I don't know, I think that could be a useful thing for us to begin with as we talk to each other. You know, this is 2 years later. How have we navigated this pandemic? How is the pandemic different now coming to the end of 2021 than it was pre-vaccine at the end of 2020? And how do we continue to draw wisdom, strength, and illumination from the work of Octavia Butler? What do you think?
That's a great place to start.
Yeah.
How has your pandemic been, Tananarive, since you started?
You know, obviously, well, first of all, I've been blessed through this pandemic. I have not had any close family losses. You know, from time to time, even now, like, for instance, author Bonnie Glover passed away. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with her work, but apparently that was COVID related. So I know it's not over, and we are continuing to lose people. I did lose an uncle to cancer last year. But I've been so blessed that my husband, Stephen Barnes, my stepdaughter, Nikki, even though she did get COVID, she recovered with only minor symptoms. Our son, Jason, who's 17 and has now decided he wants to be homeschooled because he liked that. He liked virtual schooling. So now we're stuck with it throughout his senior year. I finished a book, my novel, The Reformatory, which is coming out next year. I finished that last year. We wrote a couple of television episodes. I would say that my pandemic, like a lot of you, has been a tale of how to adapt to this new circumstance and in some cases improve upon the previous lifestyle. I mean, for instance, right now I'm still teaching from home at UCLA, and I've petitioned to teach from home next quarter, fingers crossed on that, which is a vast improvement in my lifestyle, because I'm not spending that much time on the road. I get to spend more time with my family and my cat. and also the homeschooling of our son is much easier when we're actually here to monitor. So and I just admire so much the stories I've heard from others about how they've adapted to this post-pandemic world. And even despite the uncertainty and frustration and fear and grief, societal grief, those moments of ingenuity that a lot of us have either witnessed in others or experienced in our own lives that are adding grace in places where we were so busy and we were so in our groove of routine, we didn't even think, wait, why do I have to leave my house to do this, do that, do that? Why am I making so many plane trips? Why? And it has forced me to really question some of those things.
Oh, and I'm so glad you've had, you know, I guess it's hard to say a good pandemic, right? But I can say I've noticed in you though, and some of it's vaccine oriented, but a reduction in your anxiety too.
Really?
You were just like, don't go anywhere, don't touch nothing. You know, and
true.
I sniffle, and maybe I'm going down. Like when we began, like all of your anxieties and fears and hypochondriac tendencies, by your own naming, not mine.
True.
We're on high alert, and I think I've noticed over some time that has calmed a bit.
Well, the anxiety has given me a lot of peace of mind. I know that there are breakthrough cases, but my real fear was dying more so than just feeling ill. Although, you know, we've had guests. I still think of Linda Addison, one of our earlier guests. She's a horror writer, if you don't know her work, a wonderful writer and poet. But she had a terrible COVID experience, and it was long COVID first of all. I mean, it
Yeah.
took her a long time to even feel halfway better. But she said at the worst of it, and she was living alone, she could just sit in her chair and think about every breath. And that has really stayed with me. That she had so
Yeah.
much courage facing COVID pre-vaccine by herself. And just to sit in that chair and have that will to live and not just be petrified every day. I had designated her as my COVID coach. If I got COVID, she was going to be my COVID coach to keep me going. But it's incredible what we're capable of when we're tested. And yeah, I can't forget that. And I'm a long way from that kind of fear. You're right.
Yeah, my pandemic it's been really mixed. I mean, I think like you, I feel really blessed that I could work from home and I didn't have some of the significant financial hits so many
Mm,
people took because of not being able to work in the ways they were used to. Right. I
yes.
had, a professor, I've taught online before for years, so switching to online was even less challenging for me than for many of my colleagues.
Right.
I don't live far from work. I don't have, I mean, to say the commute to work in LA is such a different story than many other places.
Almost
I don't
anywhere
have a
else.
far commute, right? I know, but I also don't miss going. Um, so I feel work was able to kind of stay maintained, right? I travel a good amount for work, but that didn't really seem to, it just made online meetings kind of suck. But that is like a
Mm.
seriously minor complaint, right? But it
You were
also meant
very
like we don't,
courageous in your travel, I would say. You were traveling before I was traveling.
yeah, well, I didn't have a lot of choices about traveling. Some
Right.
of that travel.
Right.
Um, but I did travel earlier than I probably would have chosen to. But I also was like, I think one thing I realized the pandemic is that people are gross, right? Like there are a lot of things we should have been disinfecting anyway. And so
True.
let's keep disinfecting all the things, right? So on that level, but it's also had a lot of grief, right? I
Mm,
have
yeah.
had my mother passed, as many of you all know, right at the beginning. We still haven't done the memorial services, which I think we're going to do soon.
Mm,
But not having that has been difficult. I have an uncle who passed away from COVID related complications. I've had friends with COVID, some with long COVID. And I think I had a house full of people like you, right? Like, and
mm,
so um, my child hated virtual school, but also was able to go back to school relatively soon. So just being in a small state with a smaller population with lower COVID rates gave us more options
right.
than being in some other places. We still took precautions. She still didn't get to play the way she's used to. We are not down with group sports yet, let me tell you.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know about that, people. She does one sport in person she didn't do before. It is still masked and not heavy cardio.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I'm still cautious in a lot of ways. I'm still wiping everything. We're still masking everywhere, even if other people aren't. Um, but I know my friends who live alone, it's harder. Like that kind
Yes.
of isolation is very difficult. And I just ache for them. So I am glad that we're, even with some vaccines and access to vaccines, we're able to get out more in that sense. But I guess I don't feel like it's over, right? I feel like I'm not ready to be back in a classroom of germy young adults.
Mm-mm.
I'm not ready to be, places without a mask on, right? I'm still wiping everything down when I travel, disinfecting clothes when I come in the house, which again, probably not a bad idea in general.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not feel. I don't go to the mall, right? Like I don't feel good about major crowds. I don't have to be in. And I know it's different around the world, right? So the kind of experience I might be having, like I said, in a relatively small state with with lower COVID numbers in some other places, is different from others. But I think I still miss some of the things, I miss like gathering in faith community, right?
Mm.
Those, being able to have large birthday parties or large, even significantly sized funerals, right? Being able to gather in the way and do rituals, right? In the ways that are really meaningful. Um, those things don't translate well online, even though I'm really happy doing a lot of stuff online. So I think in that sense, but I also don't feel as fearful, like you said, right? I feel like, okay, even if I get it, I might not go down. And that's what we're trying not to do, right? I still am convinced I had it very early on. Have we even had that conversation on here? But I
You
think
might
I
have mentioned
really,
that. You might have mentioned that
yeah,
once at least, that
right.
you're
I
suspicious.
got, yeah, I was real sick in December of 2019. And so I suspect maybe I had it and had a little bit of immunity, and like the whole house had it. We were just down for about 3 days, and didn't so much as think to call a doctor because we weren't deathly ill. We were just sick, right?
Mm-hmm.
After traveling through 5 airports. So it
Mm.
really makes a lot of sense that we might have international airports too, right? That we might have had COVID. So I feel like I'm just beginning to see my family who lives driving distance again. We're still like, making sure we're safe. If I see friends, I travel, we're still all testing, like doing rapid tests or PCR tests before we get together. And I feel okay about that. Like, I feel like these are good protocols.
That's great that you are still upholding all the protocols. And so sorry again, really, about your losses, Monica. And for those of you who are watching this who've also had losses, I would particularly recommend our last webinar with Adrienne Marie Brown,
Right.
who wrote a book called Grievers, which is fiction, but like all fiction, it's really about life. And as the title implies, it is just, I almost wanted to call it a joyful expression, or unpacking of grief. Not that it isn't sad and that the events in the book aren't tragic, but they're not events that we don't recognize. The book is very much about, and I mean, it was almost written for this pandemic, even though it wasn't written for this pandemic. But the way it wrestles and unpacks grief, Adrienne is just a delight. And this book is no exception. So if anyone is of particularly heavy heart, check out that last month's broadcast on Grievers with Adrienne Marie Brown.
I mean, so many good just ideas and lessons. I mean, I think we've talked about this a lot on the show with different guests, but I think also we've learned collectively a lot about rest and about boundaries, this break, about preparedness, about the ability to adapt to change, because we all had a real big adaptation really quickly. Some people just really resist it. Other people are like, let's see how we do this. But I think all of us had our mettle tested in a way, right? To see like, oh, well, we talk about being adaptive. Now let's all see how we adapt, because we all had to adapt in some way.
Yeah, we have. And I can't help thinking of Octavia, of course. Adapt or die is pretty blunt. one of your see, right? Isn't that literally what it says? Adapt or
Like,
die.
adapt or die. I mean, well, yes.
So, I mean, yes, Octavia, so true. Never ceases to amaze me how little of this would have surprised her. I'm still wrestling with a little bit of surprise over the power of denial, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised, because my philosophy about denial is, and I might have mentioned this in a previous webinar, is it is really a defense mechanism that we have so that we don't stay preoccupied with our mortality all the time, so that we're not just paralyzed with the fear of death from the time we are cognizant that life is temporary. I mean, you could make the argument that you could just sit in bed all day and shake, right, over the idea of mortality. So what we do is we put it out of our minds. We have a denial of our mortality that is very strong when we're young and we're adolescents and we're in our 20s and we engage in all kinds of risky behaviors. And as we get older, we start to adapt to less risky behaviors, because by now we've seen the signs of aging. Oh, what's that crick? I slept wrong. So it's like, oh, well, hold on. If the body is shifting and if I am getting a few gray hairs, maybe this death thing is real. Let me change my diet. Let me start exercising more. So we become more and more willing to embrace the notion of death as we get older sometimes. But I really do feel like things like COVID denial, with all the, yes, there's a lot in that gumbo. There's racism, there's politicization, there's Trumpism, there's that.
Oh, that changed over the pandemic, thank God. Can we talk about that for a second?
True. Hey, oh my goodness. Yes.
Yeah. So I just had to interject. I mean, that was part of the terror too, I have
Let's
to
just
say.
I know it's not perfect, everyone. I know we're not where we need to be, but just if we can frighten ourselves for a moment with the very thought of what things would look like right now if he who shall not be named had been elected to a second term.
I
Okay.
know.
Just, I mean, wow.
All the rich would have had vaccines. And nobody else.
And again, there are huge, vaccine disparities. And we saw a great example of prejudice and pandemic recently with South Africa, with its top-notch scientists saying, hey, flagging, this new variant. And now we're getting the travel ban. Hello. It was in Europe before it was here.
No.
They didn't speak up. We spoke up. There was a fascinating conference on Twitter where you could just hear all of these scientists and healthcare workers from throughout the continent unpacking all of this and how they get old vaccines and how Botswana, I think, was talking about how they're willing to pay for the vaccines, but then they don't get the deliveries or they're charged higher rates. I mean, there are just so many horrible things happening. Yeah. That definitely need to be changed, but I don't even think we can wrap our minds around what life would be like on a daily basis under that man again, and the next 4 years under that man again. So, thank goodness for that, at least.
And I mean, and that's the part that, speaking of Octavia Butler, that she really did foresee. I mean, she kind of saw the direction and the possibility and probability and eventuality it became, right, of where freedom was going, where political power was going. I mean, we talk about, I mean, this was what got it, right? This was the text between you and me, like, hey, the world's looking like Parable the Sower. And this is something you and I have probably been reading since the book came out, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Since the 90s, when 2022 and 2023 seem really far away.
Long time ago, but closer every year.
Like the future. We are knocking on the door of the years that she's writing about.
And it feels like it.
It really does. And I loved, of course, Parable in part. I mean, I hadn't lived in California when I first read it. So once I moved to California, I was like, oh, I really get this walking up the five thing in a new way. And I understand the fires in a new way because of, I guess you could call it fire season, right? I mean, there is a fire season in Southern California.
Oh yeah, it's devastating.
Right, it is. So I understood the climate in a new way. But I always loved Lauren. I just have always loved this bold, fierce, woman girl, right? This young woman who forms community and has some ideas that weren't really popular at the time she's having them. And who has a theology that, of course, I think rocks. And it's like, hey, I have some ideas about God, and I have some ideas about how the world works, and I have some ideas about community, and let's get together around these. I'm like, that is what we do. That's what we're supposed to be doing, people, right? I mean, I said that as a religion scholar, as a religious leader, but even just that, in that she was so vulnerable herself, and that didn't stop her, right, from still having these ideas and still wanting to be in a certain kind of community. Like, I've always loved that.
It is. And that reminds me of, one of the questions that someone posted for us, which has to do with this question of hope. And when you mention Lauren, of course, I think of hope. And the question is, what tools or teachings are you holding close during times when your hope for the future is waning? Whether it's the never-ending COVID pandemic, the continuing normalcy of white supremacy, or environmental destruction. It's a lot. Hope has been difficult to access lately. And that is such a beautiful question. This is the question we wrestle with. This is the question that comes to mind when you talk about the loss of a faith community. For people who had a faith community, that was what you walked out with after those services, was a renewed sense of vigor in life and hope in life. And we're being asked to try to find ways to either replicate that, if that was our way, or to add new ways. And for me, young people, I hate to say it, it's a cliche, but it's not an accident that Lauren is so young in Parable of the Sower, because young people come to the world with fresh eyes. They haven't been beaten down by, 2 decades on diversity committees or whatever.
You did not.
Whatever else we've been dealing with. It's like, okay, take your turn at it. We've been trying to turn this wheel, and sometimes not doing it effectively. Sometimes we were trying to turn a wheel inside of a system when the whole time we should have been outside of that system. And sometimes it does take those young, fresh eyes to identify the issue, identify the solutions. Not every slogan resonates with me or sounds realistic to me, but I'm like, you know what? Go for it. If that's what y'all think the answer is, I'm going to try to learn from you. I'm going to try to see this from your point of view. I'm going to try to capture your imagination. And the other part is just that there's so much beauty around us. So that gives me hope too. My kitties are just like a small piece of that beauty. No wonder they were worshipped by the ancient Egyptians. I mean, look at them. They're incredible. But beyond that, family, random kindnesses I see that people do for each other on social media. We hear so much about the terrible acts, but I really gravitate to stories of acts of kindness, because I know that so many of us are good and do want the best for the world. Even people we disagree with, can be fundamentally good. And that gives me hope, just as art does. And I'll end it there. And that was where Octavia, I think, really leaned in terms of finding her own hope, was in creating these stories of leaders, Black women, who often reluctantly rise to leadership positions. Ain't no part of Lauren that wanted to have to be leading anybody, but it was like leading because that was her way of surviving, her way of addressing her fears, and because she was willing to stare into the abyss in a way that the adults around her were not. She emerged as a leader. And that really is where most leaders emerge. It's like, no one else is doing this. Well, I guess I have to do this. That was how my mother, my late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, and her sister, my aunt, Priscilla Stevens Krause, who's still living, students at Florida A&M University, started a chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, because they were excited by the sit-in movement in Greensboro. So let's do sit-ins here. And there might be 3 people at the meeting. Any of you who are in activist spaces know how it starts. It starts with 2 or 3 people at the meeting, and then there's an action. The action gets publicity. The next thing you know, it's a march of 1,000. And that cycle gives me hope.
And the way you put that, reminding us that it's like, it's a text, it's like 3 people at a meeting, it's 2 people sitting around talking, that start something new, right? And that can create change. I think I have hope there, right? That there, even in the things that we've lost, and there's been so much loss. I mean, I think that's really the big pandemic thing, right? Is not that we don't always have loss, but there's been so much of it, right? So many lives lost, so many people sick, so much burnout with healthcare workers, right? That we've, not that there weren't always disparities, but wow, if this didn't show the disparities, right? In new ways. And so that even amidst that we have tried to be creative, right? That we have met, we have Zoomed a lot, right? People have gotten on the phone and tried to create new ways of being community, new ways of affecting change, new ways of sharing information, ways of collaborating. I think I see a lot of hope in that. And what you brought up about that came up a lot with Parable and in so many of Octavia's work, and for us during the pandemic, is survival, right? I mean, we're just like, oh my gosh, how do we survive this, right? How do we just live through it, whether it's a go bag or real go bag, right? Or a virtual go bag. or a grief go bag, which we can talk about later. Womanist theology has always talked about survival and that, like, hey, we can't be free if we're not even alive. Like, survival is an important first step. And I think we've thought more intentionally about what are the things we need and then what do we not need, right? What can we leave behind? And what are the things that are important for us to be alive and to be whole? And even just having those kinds of thoughts and conversations and ideas, I think there's a lot of good that comes out of that. And that we've seen a lot of that with the the model, I guess you could say, the stories that Octavia tells. And so many of us have been able to psychically survive by our own acts of creativity, right? Whether it's been writing, journaling, coloring, just all different kinds of ways. Cooking, baking bread, gardening, right? The ones we saw a lot
Remember those pandemic hobbies we had that
sourdough
fell by the wayside?
when we were all home for a long time. But we could still be home. Like, it is easing, it is changing. But I hope that those are some of the things that we take from it, that we keep those things with us.
Yeah, I don't expect to return to a pre-pandemic lifestyle, full strength ahead, full power ahead by any means. I am much, much more careful about which out of town invitations I accept. It's just like, do I want to be in that city? Do I know anybody in that city? Then why? I as a writer, I'm a little bit of a hermit anyway. So
little bit.
Okay, a lot of a hermit anyway. So if I don't have to leave, why do I have to leave? I like my house and my family and my cats in my office, and balancing that, of course, with getting enough sunlight and vitamin D and being in the world. And when I fly now, I do talk more to people I'm sitting next to. I had an amazing conversation with a woman on the first flight I took post-vaccine who had lost her son. It started with an innocent question. She mentioned my son, and then I asked if she had any kids, and she had a child who drowned at 8. And instead of that being a conversation stopper, it became this beautiful moment of sharing with a stranger who empowered me with her approach to grief. She was being proactive with her grief and writing a book, and that would hopefully, she thought, help prevent other parents from going through what she had been through. And so there is a balance between being around people and not being around people. But I did notice a question. I hope Izula, is that the way you pronounce your first name? About parable being read as an Afro-pessimistic text. And I'm not an expert on Afro-pessimism, so I'm going to start by saying that. You may know something more about it than I do, Monica. I'm not going to say it's new, but it's something that I see being discussed more than, say, in previous years. And I would say that there are probably elements of Afro-pessimism, obviously, if you look at the dystopian nature of it. But also what makes it, to me, Afrofuturism is that it is embedded with a sense of hope. And someone may want to say in chat what they think their definition of Afro-pessimism is, because I tend to relate to it exactly what it sounds like. Like you're looking at sort of the cycles of discrimination, the cycles of violence, and having sort of a reckoning with it, saying, listen, we're going to fight against these elements and we're going to fight, but they are very resistant to change. And maybe just sort of being mindful of that resistance. Now, I don't know, as what my problem with even the word pessimism is that it doesn't imply an action to me, so I don't know. Does that mean it's devoid of hope? And that's why I'm the last person to try to actually fully answer that question, because as pessimistic as much of Octavia's work was, it is embedded. The whole point of this book is hope. The whole point of Parable the Sower is to show a path through this pain and through this violence. The whole point of Dawn, for example, is to try to draw a map to what's starting over looks like and feels like, and the conflicts that come around creating community. So I that, you know, I need to learn more about it, but I tend to gravitate toward the hopeful aspects of Octavia's work. I think she's very well grounded in her pessimism, because we are what we are. Everywhere we go, there we are. We do these things. We have these
out there peopling.
Yeah, we have these hierarchies, and we rank each other on these hierarchies, and we don't confront reality with enough vigor often to create lasting change. So yes, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, Isula is saying, if I'm pronouncing your name right. So yeah, I think all of us have to find that balance as we approach Octavia's work and as we approach our lives, is to not shy away from looking at the thing that scares us, because if we don't look at it, we can't see the path through it.
I mean, I would have said the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would have said, you know, I mean, a little more about Afro-pessimism, but I don't like it that much because I'm really interested in the hope, right? And in the possibility, and in focusing on ways we can be creative without, of course, lying to ourselves, right? I don't think that necessarily is a part of Afrofuturism either.
No.
So, you know, I'm looking, we have so many great questions, and I guess I'll pick this one. We could pick any of them. So hard to choose. But oh, well, yeah, I'll try this one. It might be related. I'll put them both out there, see what we come up with. One person asked in advance, what inner work do we need to do to prioritize for mental and emotional well-being? And for me, that somehow seems to relate to a question about what practices and ways of being has pandemic experience inspired us to cultivate for 2022. And, you know, because I guess maybe the things that I'm cultivating for 2022 are related to, right, mental and emotional well-being. And partly, you know, some of it is the rise of some really great social media accounts like the Map Ministry and others. And I think we've had much more conversation, I guess, about, you know, the grind and rest and the need for attention to mental health, right? I mean, every therapist is booked. They were not booked before the pandemic. And, you know, people had problems then, right? But people really realized, like, oh, I need mental health care. Even, I mean, can I just say how much I love that, like, health insurance companies have eased up on this, like, you can't telehealth, right? So telehealth is like, they would not approve those things. It was possible before. Zoom existed before. Phones existed, but now they're like, oh, wait, you know, we really can do this. Like, yeah, you can.
And even therapists who will say they don't do telehealth. You know, I found one because we found one for our son who was like, oh, we don't do, but they will.
Yeah, you do. Right, exactly.
They will if they have to.
Right, I mean, my daughter had an orthodontist evaluation, like, just put your teeth up to the camera, right? I mean,
oh, wow.
So, I know, it was amazing. Like, don't move, click, take a picture, right? So, I mean, I think it's, you know, shown us how important, right, our mental well-being is, in addition to our material well-being. And one thing that I am becoming better at, I think, and want to continue becoming better at, is just trying to cram less stuff in a day. Like, just, you know, slowing my roll in a way, and say, okay, here are 3 things. That's good. You know, or here are the 5 things. Not here are the 25 things. And being me frustrated I couldn't get them done. Of course you can't get them done. That's too much, right? And I think grief has slowed me down a lot. And I think what I did mention, this might be a tangent, but you mentioned not enjoying not traveling as much. And I think where the travel got me was I've had a couple really good friends get cancer, and I couldn't go to them, you know, like I would have. And when my mom passed, my friends would have normally descended upon my house and stayed here and done these kind of acts of care that were like, we can't do. So I think that's where the travel got me, right? In terms of like being able to be present and have people be present and realizing how significant that is. And so I think as I had to kind of manage this in a different kind of way than I ever anticipated that I would, I'm like, okay, then slow down, do less, you know, um, focus on three things, and that's enough. In addition to keeping the kid alive and all those,
Right.
which is enough right there. Can I tell you, pandemic parenting? We could do a session. We could do a whole webinar.
And bless all the teachers. Let's just say a shout out to those
All the
teachers.
teachers.
Well, I include college professors as well, but if you're teaching in secondary school, elementary school,
Especially
wow.
elementary. I mean, I could at least tell my kid to go get a book. If you had a child who couldn't read yet, trying to learn to read on Zoom, that was insane. For everybody, for everyone. So
Very
shout out to
challenging.
teachers and to parents and to all the and I think even the experiences we've had have been because we had jobs we could do at home, and so many people didn't, right? And feeling quite grateful to people who continue to work outside the home, but frustrated, right, that we live in a world, in a society, just in this country, right, with all the privilege that and monies that the United States has, that still fissure so deeply around class and income.
One of the interesting statistics to come out of the pandemic, especially this year, is the low jobless rate. Low is a relative term. I'm sure joblessness is still a mess, and there are a lot of people still struggling to find their footing post-pandemic. But this idea of a worker shortage, because so many workers during the pandemic were like, no, I'm not going to do that.
Part.
I'm not going to do that. I found this other thing I'm going to do. And I would just love to see a documentary on people's stories. Like, yeah, I was doing this. That sucked. I said, hey, why did I do this? Because it feels like that is what the whole country has been doing. They're like putting their foot down. They're like, this job is not worth it. This job is not worth the frustration. It's not worth the exposure to death. I found a hookup over here. I'm going to create my business over here. I love the ingenuity and the adaptation that as a society, so many workers have leaned into. And I hope that's a trend that will continue. There isn't enough made of it, and there hasn't been enough impact. I don't see enough stories saying, oh, well, we just decided to raise our salaries, which is happening on the down low. Obviously, companies are figuring it out. Like, oh, if I pay them more, they'll actually keep working here. But I really love that there's this feeling of a silent workers movement. Starbucks just unionized. I think the first Starbucks just unionized. I forget where.
In Buffalo, New York.
So it's baby steps, but it feels like progress. And that for workers. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because people are proclaiming my value is higher than what I was being paid. I don't have to depend on someone else to decide what my life looks like. I will decide what my life will look like.
And, I think at least people, I'm going to say maybe those of us who are here on this webinar, right, are not thinking about going back to normal. And so we have this opportunity to say, what's our new normal going to be? And what are we not getting down with? What is just not going to happen, right? Like, what are we not going to allow in our new normal? And what are the things we need to be thinking about and be more attentive to, right? I mean, whether it's the fact that I'm going to keep wiping stuff down and wearing masks for a good time, because we probably should have anyway in big crowds during flu season, right? But, I think we've had these creative ways of thinking about, what do I want this future to look like? Because, can I say this? I mean, we're in a pandemic, but it's not going away, right? Like, viruses mutate. That's what they do. The flu that everybody was getting flu shots for was the flu of 1918, right? Like, it didn't go away. And so I think in a way, it's more like, how are we thinking about being in a world that has COVID in it, right? That, there's not going to be a post-COVID, like there wasn't a post-flu. I mean, even vaccines we've had for a long time. I mean, right? Like polio, MMR, they still exist, right? Like, there are still polio cases in parts of the world from 2 years ago, right? So it's not like diseases go poof, right? So it's more, how do we live in a world with a really a highly contagious airborne disease.
And
I know that wasn't very hopeful, but
no,
I'm
no.
saying I think it's the saying. I think we're done. Like, we can't wait till it's over. It's not going to be an over.
No, there certainly won't. And that's why we definitely want to hold tight to these lessons. And I was just noticing something that James said in the chat, that for a lot of people, the lockdown was the first time in their adult life they were not flat out busy and exhausted, which is a tremendous opportunity for change. I mean, just one example of this is that I listened to a podcast with interviews with top comedians, and, you know, live entertainment was dead during much of 2020. And a lot of these comics who spend an inordinate amount of time on the road were forced to just stay at home. And so story after story after story of people taking better care of themselves, spending more time with their families, working on new material. You know, it's all an opportunity if you can make it one, and if you can afford to not have the work. That's the other part. A lot of people could not afford. But the adaptation, you know, a woman who lost a lot of income doing Lyft or Uber was making a pretty decent income doing Instacart and DoorDash. And that made me feel better about all the DoorDash orders I'm making, because it is helping, and maybe not in the best way, but helping people make a way out of no way, you know, when their livelihood had dried up. So I think,
and all those, I mean, I used those services before, and all those prices have gone up, which is good, right? Because it means they're actually like taking better care of the people who are working for them, right? So they put more fees in there, which might be an inconvenience to me who's paying for it, but it also is a signal that, like, oh, we actually have to do a little better care for the people who are the drivers or the delivery people or the whatever, you know, all those different workers. And I think that's good.
I think so too. And taking the surviving and thriving mindset with us from 2020 and from 2021 into the future is going to be very important. Yes, it is very tempting to exhale and say, oh, thank God that's over. But you're absolutely right, Monica. I think that really for the foreseeable future, we will consider it very naive that we went to airports without masks during flu season. What? So you're just gonna go get sick? Is that what you're saying? It will look different. We're gonna start seeing it more in our media. Right now, our media is kind of pretending that there's no pandemic. We don't see a lot of media with masking. If you've noticed that, a lot of it is still escapism to pre-pandemic or post-pandemic or some world that isn't quite our world. Some of them do lean in, but you know what I'm talking about. Like every major release I've watched on Netflix over the last grading period has been maskless. But
if you know people in the system, kind of like when we had Nicole Bahari on, or I have a friend whose children are now in theater, like those protocols are no joke though, right? I mean, they're usually like testing, isolating, potting, testing.
Oh no, they are. And like Nicole said, you're putting your life in someone else's hands, you know. But it's interesting the projection that the media is making of what daily life looks like. And in fact, it does look like that in Texas and in parts of Florida and, you know, in a lot of red states. It does look like that. They're not masking. They're not masking in the restaurants and the grocery stores and the comedy clubs, but a lot of us are, and we are not being reflected in the media. And I think that's going to change over time, because it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, I mean, when you mentioned the airports, that really got me, right? Because I now have students, and of course, my own child who's born after September 11th. And they have no memory of like just walking into an airport, right? You know, you could just kind of go in, watch the planes land. Like this was my mom and a kid, right? You could just walk right on up to the windows, and they have no sense that there's not high security, right, in airports.
But you could just walk up to the gate and wait for people to come off a plane.
Right. And you could just, even if you weren't waiting for someone, you could just walk and watch the planes come and go. Like you could just, an airport was almost like a more public space, right? I mean, of course it was great because, like I said, it's a great entertainment for me as a child. Like, let's take the kid who won't stop running around to the airport to watch the planes land. And that's exciting when you're like 3, right? But it's hard to remember that in some ways. So I think it's a way of reminding us that we can create new normals, right? So that in 20 years from now, because clearly there are plenty of cultures and societies that wore masks and that was much more normalized, right? Like in some East Asian countries.
I remember
Um,
asking Asian travelers or an Asian American traveler once. I finally worked up the nerve to ask why the mask, because I saw it so often at the airport,
right.
and it really rocked me back on my heels, because my assumption as an American was it's to protect me from getting sick. But their answer was it's to keep someone else from getting sick. And I was like, oh, wow, that's how people think. They actually
thinking of other people
out of their way to make a change so that they won't hurt other people. Yeah, incredible.
So, I mean, it would be really great if that's some of our new normal, right? That like, hey, if it's just, you know, whether we're doing it all the time or we're doing it certain months of the year, like this is just what we do. And that there'll be maybe a generation, right, that will think of the things that seem such an imposition, right? Will just be like, that's just what you do. It's just normal. You just, you know, when you buy baby clothes for a new baby, you buy little baby masks, right? or whatever the case might be, right?
You don't instinctively reach out for that handshake. I know I still go like this when people try to shake my hand.
That we elbow bump a little bit more,
right.
Or right. I mean, we could keep those disinfectants all over the place, especially in like public places. Like nobody's mad about that.
They should have been cleaning it all the time.
Anyway, exactly. So, I mean, I think so. Some of those things becoming more normative, and even if the mindset, right, of like, let me change my behavior for the betterment of others, which is a pretty big mind shift for the United States.
It is.
But if we can get even a little, no, but we can get a little bit of that.
Yeah,
that would be amazing, right? To just think like, you know, what I do and where I go and how I breathe and how I stand next to somebody has an impact, right, upon others. And I should be more mindful of that. I think that would be good. That would be something I would love to see in the new normal.
And also, I think understanding that we are not as isolated as, especially in the United States, as we like to think we are, that we are part of a world community. And rather than looking at foreign nations as like undue influence or invaders and all those things that we're taught to view the world, we are a part of that world. And what happens here affects South Africa. And what happens in South Africa affects England. And if we can grow into more of an international mindset where we're learning from other cultures, we're learning from like African nations. Listen, they may not have the resources and they may have way more poverty than we do, but they have learned how to manage pandemics in ways that we haven't had to learn how to manage pandemics. So when you look at the top nations for infections, you don't see African nations in those top nations in a way we might have expected, because we're so used to thinking, oh, poor sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, I'm not saying there aren't struggles, and I'm not saying they don't have a lot to overcome, but we have a lot to learn from those cultures too.
Indeed.
And Lisa, you're so right. We learned how nasty we are. We learned how that sort of individualistic sort of American dream mindset, that pursuit of happiness clause, really makes us selfish sometimes.
Yeah.
Often.
The individualism, right?
It's a selfishness. And if we're a community, let's act like one.
Well, we had a really great question too, that I think is right where we should go. And someone says, this came in earlier, how do we manage and prepare and cope without our guidance, without ours, without Octavia trying to
our guidance? Oh.
Yes, I know, without our guidance and support, since we're winding down. And we thought about that, and we have something we want to share. Can you talk a little bit about it, Tananarive?
It's something called the Shaping Change Bundle. Some of you are members of this group or heard us talking about the fact that we had a community called Shaping Change, but we're also discontinuing. But we're not going to discontinue a bundle, which is designed as something that you can keep and have a part of your toolbox for dealing with the pandemic world. It's a recording that my husband Stephen Barnes and I did with Octavia Butler a few years before she died. So you get access to that, and to hear her laughing is such a joy. The 7 steps of Octavia's method of shaping change, which we talk about in that workshop, the Shaping Change e-journal. This is really important, and I think I've been doing more journaling during the pandemic. Hopefully you have too. Super, super helpful. And we tried to create a journal that is focused on looking inward to what you need, and also to what you can do for others. It's a way to start and end the day with mindfulness. And then the Shaping Change Creativity Spark of guided writing prompts for those of you who are writers. So many of the short stories I've published have been from prompts, and the prompts can be very useful in helping you come up with journal entries or fiction, whatever it is you'd like to write.
So if you're with us live, you actually have a button popping up that you can just click to see more about it. If you're not with us live and you want to just kind of say, where do I go next? You can go to shapingchange.co. You can actually also go to octaviawebinar.com and you'll get there, where you can learn more about it and access it. But we're like, hey, we can't just end this and
no, leave you all hanging.
Right. And we wanted to share with you the resources that have been meaningful for us as well, and have been meaningful for our Shaping Change community, and for you to have a chance to kind of take those with you. There's also another little sneak part in there that we didn't mention, which is just some of our favorite resources, right? Not just for Octavia Tribe, but some places where, you know, if you're creative about putting together your go bag, or if you're like, I need to Amazon my go bag, it's not Amazon, but you get the idea. Like,
somewhere.
Surely someone has put this together ahead of time, you know?
Earthquake bags.
Right, we list some of our favorite resources there as well. So you can grab those things.
If you're here live and you're like, where's that offer button? It's on under the chat button. You'll see something called offers, and it's a little shopping cart. And it has a red dot to get your attention. So if you click on that, you'll see how to click to get that Shaping Change bundle. But it is also, like Monica said, at shapingchange.co. Was that right?
CO, yeah.
Yes.
Like co for community.
And listen, we're not going anywhere in terms of life. We both are still very present in social media. So you can follow me on Twitter at Tananarive Due, and Monica.
You cannot find me on Twitter, but you can find me on Instagram. I mean, I'm technically there, but you'll find me on Instagram.
There.
We are there. Rev Dr. Monica.
Rev Doctor. It just has such a great ring to it.
You know, when I first started that, I was really excited about them. And now I'm like, you know, just call me Monica and be kind. They are hard-earned titles. They were hard-earned titles.
No, they sound really great. Since I have neither of those, I'm really impressed by those titles. Yeah, please do also look up our previous episodes. We actually got a grant. Monica really is responsible for that, to help create a platform where you wouldn't just have to search around through YouTube and maybe catch one here, catch one there. It's all laid out for you in one place. Our entire 22-month run, once we get this one up, of these webinars, and our guests have included everyone from Octavia's former agent, who told us things that we couldn't have leared otherwise.
We got so much scoop, so much from her. You won't even talk about it. You have to watch it to get
right. I mean, John Jennings and Damian Duffy, who did the great Parable of the Sower graphic novel and Kindred graphic novel that won the Bram Stoker Award.
Toshi Reagan came on.
Reagan, oh my gosh. And she told us something I have never forgotten, which is something that we all need to remember as we go forward beyond this webinar, is that all of what we've been talking about is in the works of Octavia Butler. That's where it starts. So
she did tell us.
It may be time for you to reread some of these novels to remember how to get that strength. But like Toshi said, Octavia didn't try to tell us. Octavia told us. And I have never forgotten that. It's like,
she had a go bag. She had a go bag ready.
It's too late to change the name. We've been on for too long. But yes, Octavia told us.
So we've had such great writers and scholars and teachers, so many people. Maybe we'll talk about that next week, right? Who are our favorites? Everyone's our favorite. Right? who came and shared with us their Octavia love and their pandemic experiences. So we are not gone yet. Hold
No,
tight.
we will live
Tell
on
your
there
friends.
on the platform and in those novels. And you can find us just as we can see many of you out there too. I follow some of you on Twitter. So everyone we'll have one more. It's a surprise guest for the last January webinar, even to us. We haven't quite narrowed down the guest.
It's not that surprise. Oh, we're working on it.
I mean, we have several that are just so, see, we're aiming so high. We got Nicole Bahari, so we got fancy and we started aiming real high. And now we're having trouble, with scheduling.
You know how to schedule real high people, right? See, we are our people. We don't have people. We are our people.
Right, we're
we
people,
kind of have people, but not really. But they have people before the people.
I know their people have people, so we're just trying to get past some of the people to get a commitment for that last one. But we will look forward to seeing you then in January, as we'll talk about starting the new year and that hope embedded in Octavia's works. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Being part of this community with us, and hold tight as we roll into 2022.
Absolutely.
Everybody. We won't be. You're not alone. We are like Octavia Tribe community, I think, and we'll be doing this together.
That's absolutely right. Everybody have a great holiday season. I know the holidays can be tough because we can be focused on memories that are painful, but try to find the joy in every day and the joy in a brand new year and all of the possibilities that lie ahead.
We will see you next month.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.